Hello and welcome to another episode of Zilog and Moto, with this week's episode venturing back into the 16-bit realm of the Sega Genesis after looking at Winter Olympics for the Master System last week. You might be asking what that venture consists of. Well, if you're not familiar with the channel, I'll lay it out real quick. My name is Dave, and I'm on a mission to fully explore the English language libraries of Sega's consoles from the 8 and 16-bit era of gaming. At least the ones released in the United States anyway. So, unfortunately, unless I hit the lottery at some point in the next 20 years, that means no releases for the SG-1000. But that does cover the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And while I'm limiting myself to consoles that were released in the United States, that is not the case for games. So if I can read what's on the screen, whether it was released in Detroit or Rio de Janeiro, I'll be attempting to collect a copy of it and review it here on the channel, complete with a look at the package and gameplay recorded from original hardware. This week's game doesn't really get into any of that nonsense about where it was originally released or potential issues of PAL video signal conversion, because not only is it a North American release, it's an exclusive to North American release, with the game only hitting the shelves on this continent and nowhere else. What kind of game wouldn't garner any interest from other countries? Well, apparently the original Bill Walsh College Football must just have not sold well in Europe or Brazil, because for the release of this week's game, Bill Walsh College Football 95, Electronic Arts decided it was best to just focus on the United States. And that makes sense to a degree, because even though the series that Bill Walsh is based on, John Madden Football, was well on its way to being a juggernaut at the time, the NFL and its teams and players are certainly more well-known than any college team around the world, despite how popular some of those teams and schools might be here. Pop quiz, what's the second game that I ever reviewed on Zilog and Moto? Yep, you guessed it, that would be the original Bill Walsh College Football for the Genesis, and if you don't believe me, feel free to go check it out, but I don't recommend it because, believe it or not, some of those early videos on the channel look really rough. I mean, seriously, if this video right now is an example of what a good quality video looks like, can you imagine back then? Yeah. I enjoyed the original Bill Walsh College Football quite a bit, giving it 3 stars, and then 100 episodes later, I followed up with a review of the Sega CD version of the game, and yes, while those releases share many things in common, it was still fun to play the game again and appreciate the few extra touches that Electronic Arts was able to add in to take advantage of the extra hardware available to the Sega CD. Bill Walsh College Football 95 finds Electronic Arts back on the Genesis instead of the Sega CD, and this time, this is the only version of the game on any platform. So Electronic Arts and High Score Productions, the same developer from the original game, only had one opportunity to get it right. So, was Electronic Arts able to take it to the house for the second year in a row and take care of all the throngs of college football fans? Or is Bill Walsh College Football 95 just a weak rehash of the previous year's effort? We shall see, but first a look at the decidedly slimmer and trimmer package from September of 1994. And this is my copy of Bill Walsh College Football 95, or as I'm going to refer to it for the rest of the review, Bill Walsh 95, because frankly that name is a bit of a mouthful. This copy isn't perfect, but it's not horrible. The outer cover definitely has some wear to it, and especially with some weird pitting on the spine over the barcode, and then also some random scratches here and there. The inner cover also seems slightly dingy, like maybe this was a smoker's copy for a bit. But again, it's not bothersome enough for me to want to get a better copy. However, if it was, it wouldn't be an expensive replacement, with copies currently only going for between $10 to $15 on eBay. I mentioned this as being a slimmer and trimmer version of the game because it literally is both of those things. As you can see in the comparison with the original Bill Walsh, it was one of Electronic Arts' wide box releases originally, whereas Bill Walsh 95 is in one of the updated EA clamshells that was more in line with what everyone else was putting on the shelves. There was actually a good reason for the original Bill Walsh to have a wide box release, because not only did it come with a thicker manual, it also had a set of cards with the stats of the players for all the teams, because there was no way to see that information in-game, and a poster and a warranty card.
As we'll see in a minute, Bill Walsh 95 has more of a standard loadout with a thinner manual and poster detailing all the plays in the game, so it gets a normal-sized case. As far as the front cover goes, it's fine, but I've got to be honest, I think I preferred the first game's cover. Having the 95 inside a football-shaped oval in the middle of the title looks kind of weird, and even though there's a picture of Bill Walsh being carried right in the center, it seems like EA tried to de-emphasize his name and have the focus be on the college football in large font versus Bill Walsh in the tiny font at the top. Maybe a portent of things to come, as this would be the last game produced with the Bill Walsh license, probably due to the fact that he retired from coaching after the 1994 season, following 2 not-so-great seasons with Stanford. Flipping over to the back, you can see one of the major improvements in Bill Walsh 95 over its predecessor, and that is the fact that Bill Walsh 95 is now an officially licensed collegiate product, which allows teams to now have their proper logos and names, versus where the teams were just generically named after the cities the colleges resided in before, and what better way to show that off than a bunch of helmets going around the periphery. Again, I think the rear cover on the previous game actually had a better layout, but this isn't horrible, and the layout of the graphics is decent. But man, those are some rough screen captures, especially for September of 1994. Not sure what was going on there, but at least they did a good job of the flavor text and bullet points, focusing on some of the new features. Opening up the box, and the manual and cartridge are in good shape, and I do have a copy that contains the aforementioned poster that I guess is supposed to be a quick reference for the plays included in the game. I mean, it's cool, I guess, but I can't imagine being in the middle of a game and feeling the need to whip this out just to find the right play. I'm certainly not going to complain about anything being included, however, especially these days. Opening up the manual, and I mentioned that it was thinner than the previous manual, which it is, with only having about half the pages, but honestly, that's totally fine, because what is included here explains the game perfectly well, and I especially like the inclusion of the quick start segment at the beginning of the manual, for when you just want a quick refresher on which button does what. Okay, that's the package for Bill Walsh College Football 95. Let's start it up and see if it quenches my off-season thirst for football. One of the big complaints to this day about sports games that are part of a franchise comes down to, well, they just re-released the same game all over again with only some slight tweaks, so why should I care? Electronic Arts is certainly an offender of this type, famously releasing editions of the FIFA Soccer series over the years that unless you saw the disc before you put it in the console, you might not actually know which year's edition of the game that you are playing. This is something that's more of a modern problem, as many of the game's features these days are standard, and gamers just expect that when you go to play a game that certain things are going to be included. However, this wasn't always the case, especially in the 16-bit era, when some of these franchises were first starting out and the developers and publishers hadn't quite figured out all those elements, and in some cases simply didn't have the resources available on a cartridge to pull off everything that they might want to do. And sure, by the time I get to comparing things like Madden 97 versus Madden 98, there's probably going to be less for me to talk about as far as differences are concerned, but for Bill Walsh 95, with it being just the second game in the series, Electronic Arts was still very much tinkering with their college football formula. I already mentioned in the box section that one of the big changes to Bill Walsh 95 was the inclusion of properly licensed teams. Of course, there are still no named players, as it wasn't even possible to license those rights in the mid-90s, and Electronic Arts is still trying to figure out a deal with current players to get their rights with the recent changes that allow them to be paid while still playing an amateur level. But just the fact now that the teams can be referred to as the Penn State Nittany Lions instead of just State College, or the Florida State Seminoles instead of Tallahassee, is a big deal. I remember specifically that the manual for the original Bill Walsh has a handy map included that shows where all of the teams are located so that you could figure out who's who if you didn't have them all memorized. And now none of that is necessary because it's very clear on who is who. However, in a slightly odd turn, even though team representation is better in Bill Walsh 95, it's also kind of worse. Bill Walsh 95 includes 36 teams from all over the country, which is a pretty standard amount of teams as compared to other sports games, with most professional leagues consisting of around 30 teams at the time. There's just one problem. The original Bill Walsh had 48 teams, so technically Bill Walsh 95 has 25% less teams. I'm not sure why Electronic Arts felt the need to reduce the number of available teams, especially since Bill Walsh 95 features a 16 megabit cartridge instead of the 8 megabit cartridge that was used for the first game. But perhaps some of the newly included licensed graphics and logos took up too much space, who knows. One reason why there might have been a need for less teams in the game is one of the other huge additions to Bill Walsh 95, and that's the inclusion of Season Mode. In the original game, you could either play one-on-one exhibition games, or you could compete in one of two 16-team tournaments, with one of the tournaments being based around the included historically great teams, and the other tournament being based around the current teams. Not that there's anything wrong with having a tournament mode, or two as the case may be, but sports traditionally don't consist of just tournaments. There's usually longer regular seasons that take place before the tournaments, where a lot of crazy things can happen due to the amount of games and the sheer number of different matchups between different teams. Bill Walsh 95 corrects this by offering a season mode that's customizable in a few different ways. You can choose whether your season consists of any number of games from between 1 to 16, with the default being 12. I'm a little surprised that they went with 12 instead of 11 due to the NCAA not standardizing on 12-game schedules until 2006, but that's a very, very minor quibble and actually works out well for today's gamers. Along with the number of games played, you can also choose between having the 16 top-ranked teams compete in a postseason tournament, or you can set things up for bowl game mode, where the top-ranked team in each of the 4 regional divisions goes to a bowl game to compete against the remaining 4 best at-large teams. I really like how both of the postseason modes were included in the game, and it's especially appropriate now as we've entered the playoff era of Division 1A college football. There's no actual conferences included in the game, with the teams being included from all over, and due to the additional licensing needed, there's no real bowl games, with fictional bowl games like the Redwood or Pecan Bowl replacing things like the Rose or Peach Bowl, but still, it's a nice setup that echoed the bowl system of the time. Another thing that I love about the included season mode is the addition of stat tracking. While not every single stat you can think of is here, many of the most important ones are, so it's easy to see how your players are comparing to all the other players from the other 35 teams. I get a lot of joy in seeing my players amongst the league leaders for stats. I don't know why, but the inclusion of the collected stats is a nice way to spend some time when you're not grinding it out between the lines or bombing away downfield to your receivers. From a gameplay perspective, Bill Walsh 95 plays more or less exactly the same as the original Bill Walsh, meaning that if you're familiar with that game or the early Madden titles, you'll have no problems with picking up a controller and getting directly into gameplay. However, Bill Walsh 95 includes both more plays and more formations for gameplay, giving you even more options for what you want to do on the field. And while I tend to run many of the same plays during a game, I definitely enjoy the additional variety provided. Along with the additional plays, Bill Walsh 95 also includes a new non-windowed receiving mode, which at least to me makes the game much better. You can still use the windowed receiving mode if you want, but I can't imagine why you would want to once you get used to the non-windowed mode, as it just gives you a much better view of the field, making it easier to see plays as they develop, rather than just focusing on small sections. Not all of the new features in the game are awesome. Some things seem to be nice ideas, but they come off a bit half-baked, and perhaps in need of some more development time. I think the two things that stood out to me that didn't seem quite right were the team rankings and the player stamina. Team rankings are something that any college football fan is going to be familiar with, as controversially, there are multiple polls in real life during the season for people to vote on as far as who the best teams are. The thing is, though, while sometimes it can be argued that perhaps a team is slightly too high or too low in one of the polls, usually they're pretty accurate. In Bill Walsh 95, I've got to be honest, I have no clue how the computer figures out how to rank the teams. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. Finish a season undefeated and you shouldn't have any problems being at the top of the charts, but as soon as you have a few losses, all bets are off. During the season that I played this week, I finished in first place at 12-0, and Miami finished in second at 10-2. After that, things got weird. Tennessee finished at 6 with a 6-5-1 record, one spot ahead of a 9-win Colorado team. And then North Carolina and Alabama finished at 11th and 12th respectively, each with 5-7 records, ahead of Washington State and Michigan, who both had 8 wins. And most confusingly, Georgia finished at 21st with only 3 wins, ahead of 10 teams that had more wins than them. I totally get that strength of schedule and quality wins are a thing, and it's not always going to be who has the most wins overall, but this just seems chaotic and in desperate need of tweaking. The other good idea, questionable implementation thing that I've got to bring up is this new player stamina system. In real life, players get tired. You can't just run the same plays to the same players over and over again and expect them to always perform the same way. That just makes sense. Unfortunately, the stamina system in the game seems to be a bit overkill. Maybe it was just the running backs that Penn State has in game, but running a running play where you would hand off to the same running back twice in a row is certain doom, and to be successful, you usually would have to give them more than a few plays off to get their breath back. And to make matters worse, the game doesn't feature any kind of player subbing, so even though you could have a perfectly healthy and rested second running back, the only way to get the ball to them instead would be to run an option play. It's not the end of the world, and I do appreciate the attempt at realism, but I just don't think this is something that should be forced on the player, as you can't turn off player energy without having a proper subbing model. From a graphics and sound perspective, you're not going to notice anything especially different about Bill Walsh 95. Various screen overlays have been updated to make the game look a bit less Madden than the previous year, but the fields and players, you know where you'll be spending most of your time during gameplay, don't look much different than before. All the Ron Bar EA Sports Network stuff is gone, and in its place you've got some digitized animation of Bill Walsh speaking that may or may not have come from what he recorded for the Sega CD version of the previous title. As far as the sound goes, it actually feels kind of quiet. During plays, the game is perfectly silent except for the various sound effects of the players grunting, and then only after a play is blown dead will you hear from the crowd. This seems a bit odd and not at all realistic. Also, the crowd noise that does get heard is a bit rough, especially if you listen to the game on headphones, as I inadvertently found out. It's a bit of a letdown after playing the Sega CD version of the previous game, but of course that's not a fair comparison. Altogether, the game looks and sounds fine, and I do like the inclusion of all the new graphics and licensed logos for the teams that have been added, but don't expect to be blown away if you're already familiar with the Madden Walsh games on the console. I had a lot of fun playing Bill Walsh College Football 95 this week, to the point that I delayed releasing this review until I had time to actually play through a whole season, which will actually take a while if you're playing the default 12-game season plus 4-round playoffs. I elected to not go with the fake bowl games. It seemed a bit anticlimactic, especially in 2023. During certain games, the game almost felt too easy, as I chose Penn State, who is probably somewhere in the middle of the teams available as far as strength goes. And even with that middling talent team, I was destroying certain opponents. And then the playoffs rolled around and, well, things got interesting. Despite some of the oddities that I've mentioned about this edition of the series, I do think it's clearly a better game than the Genesis version of Bill Walsh College Football. And given the choice, I would strongly recommend Bill Walsh College Football 95. However, even with the improvements of licensed teams and the full season mode, I still can't bring myself to award the game more than 3 stars. As good as it is, it still has some bizarre artificial intelligence issues during gameplay that will definitely make you say WTF a few times during the game. And don't get me started on why teams like Army, Navy, Cal, and Virginia were included over more traditional big names like Michigan State, UCLA, and Virginia Tech.
Okay, and that was Bill Walsh College Football 95 for the Genesis. I think if I had to sum up the game in one line, it would be to say that it's very fun, but there's still clearly room for improvement. I'll be very curious to play Sega's own College Football's National Championship, which released a month before Bill Walsh College Football 95, and see how they measure up against one another, but that's a discussion for another time. Perhaps I'll throw that one on the schedule this fall during the actual college football season if there's a slot available and it makes sense. We'll just have to see. However, next time on Zilog and Moto, well, I just kind of laughed when I looked at what I had written down originally. A few months ago, I decided to finally try to work in Phantasy Star 2 into the schedule, seeing as how I reviewed the original Phantasy Star way back in episode 4. And I have played Phantasy Star 2 a bit over the last few months, but nowhere near enough to do a proper review. It's kind of hard if you haven't heard. Anyway, instead I'll be bumping that back to hopefully before Christmas, and in its place, well, it's a game that I'm sure isn't going to be nearly as interesting as Phantasy Star 2, but the goal of the channel is to review all of these games and not just the interesting ones. And it's not a sports game, so there's that at least. In the meantime, I'm going to go review my mortgage and property tax law. Maybe it'll help me prepare a bit for next week. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 202. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.